Hi, and welcome to Studio Bonn, Contracts for Earth, in the Bundeskunsthalle. In the next 90 minutes, we will explore 3 new models to reorganize global value flows in the interest of social justice and sustainability. I'm Kolja Reichert, and please welcome my guests tonight. Julia Watson, Mathieu Kasyama, a warm applause, please. Siddhartha Masala, Youssef Nassef, and Renzo Martens.
Un aspect qui a toujours été derrière notre projet, c'est de faire de la post-plantation. Nous amenons la biodiversité. Et pour l'écologiste que je suis, c'était intéressant de dire, voilà, ces terrains pauvres, on peut les restaurer.
Le cacaoé, bananier, makemba na palmier. Et les autres, la sous la terre. Tous les sous, on a 65 hectares. Vraiment, oyo, ezali bambongo, ya monde ya l'art, monde de l'art, yango yo.
We live in a time of renegotiation of global relations and the examination of debts and crimes from the past. Just at the moment when all eyes are on preventing the examination of life on Earth in the near future. In Studio Bonn's series Exchange Values, we have been looking for a year now at how blockchain technology could inspire new collaborative models for culture and the commons. Today we are going very, very global. You might have heard of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, the international legal framework that ties its member nations to the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Agreement. One of the leading persons behind these agreements is with us tonight. He works just next door here in Bonn. Diplomat, computer scientist, and a man of many other disciplines, Youssef Nassef. Warm welcome. Youssef leads the adaptation program in the UNFCCC and is hosting the Bonn Climate Conference right now these days. And if you have read the announcement for tonight in the first paragraph about industrial revolution having failed, whereas indigenous economies have worked for millennia, this is by Youssef, I stole it. Youssef, how much time do you give Earth before human-led destruction?
It's really a function of how and when we transform. And so, given my optimism, if we actually embark on a new paradigm, in a paradigm that prioritizes well-being, moves us from an extractive relationship with nature to one that is regenerative, then I think we have a very, very long time. However, if we do not do that and continue on our destructive path, I think it's a matter of decades or centuries at most.
Siddhartha and Mathieu, you traveled from Lusanga in West Congo, where the world has already ended around 130 years ago, with colonialism forcing people to work on plantations. Your soil is depleted from monoculture. And with the Congolese Plantation Workers Art League, you work on restoring it by using returns from sales of your artworks to reintroduce biodiversity and cultural life. If you could answer shortly with an estimate, how long will it take to restore your region?
Oui, merci pour la parole. Je crois que ça nous prend plus ou moins 20 ans pour...
Thank you for letting me speak. I think it will take roughly 20 years to restore trees and soil. Thanks to the monopoly that has been destructed, that has been built on this earth for the past 50 years. It will simply take time. We have to plant trees and then see how they grow slowly.
Thank you. And yesterday you were in Art Basel, the art fair in Basel, where you had a revolutionary NFT drop, about which we will hear later a bit more. If anybody is unfamiliar with the term NFT or blockchain, we have an online glossary on studiobonn.io. Julia Watson came from New York, has actually traveled Europe for a few weeks with her family after opening an exhibition in the Barbican where she is present. You have researched indigenous technologies for building and farming around the world and gathered them in the inspiring and beautiful book Lo-TEK at Taschen Publishing House. And we intended to invite Julia since the conception of Bundeskunsthalle's think tank, Studio Bonn, so thank you very much for coming. Julia, capitalism is enforcing short-term planning, usually about like the time frame of one generation, maybe 30 years. What time cycles do people think in that you have spoken to in your research?
Yeah, I talk about this in the book, actually, this idea of intergenerational thinking, and it's not speaking for communities, but what I've learned is usually the 7-generational thinking, and that can be 150 to 250 years. But in that, there's also this idea you're looking forward. So you might do something that you know you'll never experience, that your children's children's children will experience. But in that as well, you're thinking back to your ancestors and you're honoring your ancestors. So this expansion of time for the future and also for the past.
Amazing. Julia will also talk about her most recent project that employs also the blockchain as a tool for economic justice and sustainability. But I also want to introduce artist Renzo Martins, whose film White Cube we used an excerpt for the opening video. Renzo was already in Bundeskunsthalle last summer to speak in our video series Artists on Boys. It's still online. And there he expands on his work, his year-long work with the Congolese Plantation Workers Art League on extrapolating global exploitation by culture and how that extraction chain could be reversed. Renzo also made this film White Cube that can be seen online, I think, when you pay.
I guess so, yes, if you pay.
And Renzo will join our discussion later, following 3 presentations. The first one is by Youssef. You know everything about the international politics and routines that are expected to end climate change at best. Could you please elaborate on how that has worked out so far? If you could take the...
As Kolja mentioned in the introduction, I work for the United Nations, and typically when you bring over a United Nations bureaucrat to talk, I would overburden you with talk about resolutions and decisions and legal aspects. But I hope to disappoint you on that, and we'll go in a very different direction into, like Kolja said, what got us here and where are we going from here and how can we think differently. And I think this will be a good segue for what we will hear from our other panelists today. So many years ago, we had, as an international community, decided already to do things to save nature, to save the earth, to be more sustainable, to take steps to protect our global commons. And I typically present some of these obligations to people I talk to and ask them to guess when these were adopted. Many will say, oh, it's probably coming from the Sustainable Development Goals of 2015 or from the Paris Agreement or something like this. But then they realize that this actually presents some obligations from 50 years ago, from the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment of 1972. And this year we are celebrating what we call Stockholm plus 50. 50 years have passed since the world decided to proceed sustainably. Of course, along the way, we've adopted a lot of other international promises to ourselves. These were governments committing to these types of obligations. But then what happened since then? We've actually embarked on a lot of unsustainable things. unsustainable agriculture. Many of the species we're growing have disappeared. Soil erosion is happening extremely fast. And one really stark statistic is that we lose the equivalent of 30 football pitches of fertile soil every minute. And we cut down trees. We have, during the COVID period, dumped billions of mass into the ocean. Birds have plastic fragments, and since the Paris Agreement was adopted, which is the current regime to control global warming, $4 trillion more have gone into the fossil fuel industry. So the question is why we have, in one direction, the intent and the commitment to go towards sustainability, but in the other direction, something is pulling us in a very different direction. And if I show you from the climate change perspective in particular, the evolution of greenhouse gas concentrations over a number of years, you will see a very steady increase. These are observations from observatories. And along the years, we've had many commitments, many landmark treaties, many landmark international legal arrangements, and yet it continued to increase. One of the explanations to this is that we have two sets of invisible hands. So technology is advancing and helping us a lot with the decline in the price of renewables, so this moves in the right direction. And the science is becoming more and more certain about the impact of what we are doing on our environment. But then on the other side, and we heard this before, this short-termism pervades our current economic system. And we are living an extractive economic paradigm. We treat nature as a resource to be used in order to further economic interests. If you will, we keep eating the golden goose rather than the egg that the golden goose gives us, while thinking that we're just eating the golden egg. Now, why can't we get this right? Is it a matter of complexity? Our negotiations on climate change and on other environmental crises are certainly difficult because they typically work with consensus. We need the consensus of all the world in order to move forward. So we move forward in very small incremental steps rather than in paradigm shifting steps. This applies to the negotiations on climate change, it applies to biodiversity, to the certification, etc. And when countries negotiate in an international system, that's a bit different from a global system. International means countries come and they also have their own national interests in mind as they try to solve a global problem. And there's a lot of intricacies associated with this type of environment. So there's a very strong pull from the existing status quo, from the existing balance of power. You don't want massive shifts to happen right away. There has to be reciprocity. Someone gives something and has to take something in exchange. National sovereignty is paramount in these types of arrangements. And progression is always slow. And I compare it to COVID, where you suddenly saw the impact and nations changed very quickly in terms of putting regulations in place, transferring resources to solve the problem. But when you have a longer term issue like climate change or biodiversity loss, it's a bit different. People take it a bit in stride, no matter how much the warning signs are. And also, when you talk about transition, people start thinking, how much will that transformation cost me? What about all the resources that are in the ground, all this oil or coal or gas? I'm not going to use it, but it's worth something. Or how can I transform my energy system when I've already invested so much in it and it still has 100 years of life in it, etc. And finally, what does the principle of equity and differentiated responsibilities mean, which is the essence of all the environmental treaties under the UN, where everyone is responsible, but obviously not everyone has contributed in the same way to the crisis, and not everyone has the same capacity to respond to the crisis. And looking at the science, we see at the left-hand side that we've already lost an opportunity to go to the best possible future. So those dotted lines are the opportunities already missed. We cannot go there anymore because we have not started living sustainably early enough. If we make the right decisions from now on, we could go on that green path to achieve a resilient future. This comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a body of science entrusted with synthesizing all the existing scientific literature and advising the international process. So my question was, is it a matter of complexity? Is this why we are not able to match our intention with action? Or is it more a question of mindset? Is it a question of values? Is it a question of worldview? And I would argue that it is more a question of this, of the values and mindset and worldview, that will be the main factor in allowing us to make that transformation towards sustainability as we move forward. Now, if we rewind back into the early days of environmentalism, we'll see that we've gone through a couple of stages. First, we saw climate change and other environmental problems merely as an environmental concern. So it had its own niche, its own silo. Eventually, people started saying, hey, these things will affect our economies too. It became developmental. So we said, okay, let's look at, how to ensure sustainable development and approach things from that concept of economic growth. Now, since 2018 and 2019, two seminal scientific reports came out that told us, no, you now have 10 years, a 10-year window, during which if you do not transform, the world is going to be doomed to a trajectory that will result in a total loss of prosperity and perhaps eventual extinction. So it became an existential concern. We know that the environmental crisis that we're going through is existential. We have not yet adjusted our systems to deal with it in that way. How do you insert existential variables in your cost-benefit analysis if you can't quantify a lot of these things? So we've been thinking within the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, how to move towards more foresight. And the idea here is to change the mindset of how we look at this. So what we need, not looking at climate change by itself or biodiversity loss by itself, but more of an overarching approach. What if each human being added to nature more than they take away from it? There's so many implications of this. You'd look at population and demographics in a very different way. Then the Earth can actually take a lot more people than it currently does. You'd look at planetary boundaries in a different way, because right now these boundaries are largely a consequence of our own way of life or unsustainable approach to managing our economy. So maybe we can enter into a phase of abundance rather than a phase of restriction. And part of the thinking centers on stopping this approach of looking at everything from a problem/solution perspective, because that always grounds you in the present rather than in designing a better future. So move from that mindset towards a mindset of creative design of the future. And the trigger for my thinking on this started with looking at all the environmental crises we've been undertaking since the 70s, air pollution, species extinction, ozone depletion, land degradation, etc., all the way to climate change and even pandemics, and seeing these not as standalone problems, but as symptoms. Once you see it as symptoms, then you start wondering, what is the real problem here? But then, on the other hand, I see a technological paradigm shift coming our way. And when we see these paradigm shifts, it loosens the bolts of our systems. It gives us an opportunity to actually redefine a lot of things. So we have AI, big data, Internet of Things, distributed ledger or blockchain, etc. And the idea here is, as we move forward, as we look into the future, even 10 years from now, the future is not just a facsimile of the present plus climate change or plus biodiversity loss. It's a totally different thing because of that shift, the techno-economic paradigm shift. So the thinking in this initiative I'm talking about, which we do from here in Bonn, is looking at the technological shift at the same time as we want to transform the way we relate to nature and how then can we guide that shift? How can we use AI? How can we use autonomous systems, robotics, etc., in some of the aspects that need that transformation, rather than leave it to move to wherever it is most profitable. So we've gone through a visioning process that resulted in basically 8 pathways towards that sustainable future. I can share that later. And now we're into the road mapping phase, looking at these entry points, things that look like black swans, the first mover actions that can actually unlock a trajectory towards that sustainability. And the pathways are very simple, even though they were done through a very rigorous foresight-driven methodology, but mostly about transforming a stewardship of nature, and then taking advantage of frontier technologies in adjusting international cooperation, and then moving towards regeneration in everything that we do. But this is not enough. It's not just about actions. Let me go back to mindset again. And I would show you a few attributes of where we are now. We moved from level 1 to level 2, basically. We are there in level 2 from my perspective, where we're still framing things in the developmental stage. We haven't yet adjusted to the existential. We talk about systemic change the systems, but not that much. There's not much paradigmatic shifts. I say we need to move from the out-of-the-box mentality to there is no box, so as to move sufficiently far from where we are now. Move from international to global. Look at the world as one entity, not just as an aggregation of different national interests. Move from thriving within limits to actually regenerating, to expand limits. Even in education, move from transdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity to total extradisciplinarity, and invent new ways of teaching certain things, and even conducting education to start with. And there's a lot of thinking going behind these things. I'm going very quickly through this. But most importantly, the one thing I would like to leave us with is zooming out and looking at big history. We've had huge transformations in humanity, from the agricultural revolution towards the industrial revolution. Agricultural revolution was 5,000 years ago or so. Then we got the industrial revolution the past 200 years. And I would like very much to instill within our coming years the need for a well-being revolution, not one that is still driven by the perspective of continued economic growth infinitely while degrading our natural support system, but how do we ensure our evolution in a way that takes account of our connectivity to nature. And learning from indigenous peoples is really important here, as my colleague will talk in a minute, especially the principles of collectivism, connectivity, and intergenerational equity. Currently, the way we teach economics and business, for example, goes against intergenerational equity, because we teach them through, for example, discount rates, which means if you do cost-benefit analysis, any losses or gains in the future carry less value than losses and gains today. And that goes totally against sustainable development. So this is one area where our rhetoric does not translate into even our educational systems or the way we conduct our lives. And finally, if one asks, what are the major global environmental problems? I mentioned a few that I consider to be symptoms, and I ask you, what is the ailment? But then I'd like to show you, as my final slide, a quotation from Gus Speth, James Gustav Speth, who was the administrator of the United Nations Development Program and held a lot of high offices in government. And he had quite a different view on what the real global environmental problems are. And I leave you with this quotation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joseph. That was a lot of content in very efficient time. I feel that you just come from a day-long conference as well. Thanks so much. And we'll go into a few points more in detail later, I think, after the next 2 presentations. One point just stuck with me especially, which was, what if each human added to nature more than they took from it? And I could imagine that Julia has some answers. Could you show your presentation and tell us what we can learn from indigenous knowledge, and also how we can support it? Okay. Is there someone? Okay, there is someone. The mouse is back.
Okay. I was actually, Youssef, thank you for that. That was incredible and inspiring. This morning, reading a report about Indigenous peoples and energy, and the quote from an Oglala elder was, "What you call resources, we call it relations." Good evening, everyone. I'm a landscape architect, so obviously this evening I'm going to show you some incredibly beautiful landscapes, but you know, some of them you might have seen, some of them you might have visited as a tourist, but what I want you to take away is that there's a different mythology surrounding some of these technologies, some of these landscapes, and this story and this mythology is that each of these landscapes are incredibly, vitally important to each and every one of us. So, myth, this is an ancient Greek word from mythos, meaning story of the people, and myths have guided mankind for millennia. One of the oldest myths that is, it's a mythological thread from all of the Earth's indigenous peoples, is that humans are part of nature. And so most indigenous languages actually don't even have a word for nature because they don't see that human beings are separate from nature. And our role traditionally has been to be the custodians of other life on this planet. But 400 years ago, intellectuals of the European Enlightenment constructed this mythology that separated humans from nature. And this was a mythology that's favored fuel by fire and feasted on the felling of forests and the extraction of resources to power the age of industrialization. And it ignored this millennia-old wisdom. It deemed it primitive. And the mythology of technology caused us to forget this really one of our most important roles as human beings, which was to be the custodians of life. And instead, we have become its greatest threat. And the mythology of the dominant global culture, it focuses on either conquering nature or saving nature. And today, nature, it seems to have become this construct that is subservient to either our superiority complex or our savior complex. However, humanity's real challenge is just not to save nature, but it's to learn to work with nature. And responding to this challenge is Lo-TEK. It's the book that I wrote, and it's also, I think of it as a movement that really reconsiders local communities and their technologies as an evolutionary extension of life in symbiosis with nature. And so my research into Lo-TEK actually began many, many, many years ago. Maybe not that many, but in my second year of architecture school, and it was a course called Aboriginal Environments, and this was actually one of the systems that I studied. It's called the Brerowina fish trap. This is a 1906 survey of this system. It's made up of large and small rocks that are on this bend in this large rocky shelf on the Barwon River in Australia. And it was used to divert water and fish into these pools so people could go and then hand fish. So the Brerowina fish traps, which if I was asked to give a show of hands, I'm pretty sure no one would recognize this. It is one of the oldest human-made structures on Earth. It dates back 40,000 years and it's still in existence. But these aren't the innovations that we talk about. These aren't the innovations that we typically are educated about, because we tend to focus on the innovations of what we call dead cultures, like the 4,000-year-old pyramids of Giza. And not to say these aren't incredible innovations, it's just to say that the problem is that we fail to acknowledge the incredible innovations of living ancient cultures. And these living ancient cultures, they actually support 80% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity with their knowledge, their land and resource management, their worldviews, and their technologies. And in the 21st century, when humankind's impact on the Earth is causing what we call the planet's sixth mass extinction, I actually don't think extinction loss is going to be remembered as this century's greatest loss, because I think casting forward, when we look back at the 21st century, what we're going to understand is that we lost the most valuable climate resilient technology that we hadn't even recognized as technologies. Because those same forces that are driving species extinction, they're also causing and threatening and causing the loss of these environmental technologies. So these are the technologies that are in Lo-TEK, designed by Radical Indigenism. And what Lo-TEK does, it questions what this dominant mythology of technology, which threatens our planet and shows how human can survive and thrive with nature, fulfilling our traditional role as the custodians of life. And it questions what we consider technology and asks whether some of our most sustainable technologies were actually created millennia ago. And these are the innovations that have been evolved and passed down through generations in response to flood and fire and drought and severe weather events and food insecurity and water insecurity. So these are the same crises that we are facing today. And they're incredibly well adapted to their environments, and they play a key role in conserving biodiversity. And so Lo-TEK, it's a word that I made up. It's a combination of two words, local and TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge. It was also written and titled as a bit of a provocation towards all those inherent biases that we have towards local communities and their technologies. And until Lo-TEK, these technologies had been classified as low-tech, T-E-C-H, and defined as unsophisticated and primitive when they're actually neither. They're incredibly sophisticated technologies that include all of today's sustainability principles like low embodied energy and low cost and low impact. And I would say that they even go beyond that. They go beyond sustainable. They're not forming closed loops, they're forming continuous flows, and they create exponential growth. They're very regenerative, and they're often governed by incredibly democratic community collaboratives. And so Lo-TEK uses TEK, which is traditional ecological knowledge, which is knowledge that is defined as being passed down through generations, and it's usually universally been ignored or exploited by Western science. And it's this cumulative body of multi-generational knowledge, practices, and beliefs. And I just want to say that again, it's knowledge, practices, and belief systems. And that's what Yusuf is talking about when he's talking about different world views. And so TEK can be understood if we were to draw a diagram and think about, well, how do I understand that in reference to myself? It's understood as the individual at the top. It's a system of nested concepts, and beneath the individual is the understanding of your local knowledge of your land and the animals and species, and then beneath that is your land and resource management systems. Below that is your social network where you have accessibility, who you can influence, and then beneath that is your worldview or your belief system, and the engagement of how a human is connected to their natural systems or sees himself as separate. And Radical Indigenism is a philosophy of Professor Eva Marie Groot. She is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and she came up with this terminology for Indigenous nations to say, look at your mythologies, look at your local knowledge, and let's think about in the context of creating new knowledge and new dialogues for today. And so this idea was translated into design to really come up with, to look at these knowledge and look at these technologies and say, well, what can we arrive at in the realm of design and sustainability and climate resilience? And so as a designer, I think that solutions embedded in environment and in community are the most effective form of resilience at scale, and Lo-TEK is a movement about building on those understandings to create new climate resilient infrastructures. So rather than continuing this very narrow view of technology that's informed by that distance from nature, where we must acknowledge that this US Eurocentric view of technology, it's just one way, and it's not the only way for humankind to progress. And what we need is a new mythology of technology, amongst other things, that includes Lo-TEK, Indigenous innovations like these ones I'll show you. So in the forests of northern India, overlooking the plains of Bangladesh, the Khasi people live in a forest that receives the most rainfall of any place on Earth. And during the monsoon season, travel between villages is cut off by this monsoonal rains that transform this landscape from this thick canopy into these isolated islands. And what they've done is they've evolved this incredible bridging innovation called the living root bridges, which are the only bridges that are able to actually withstand the force of the rain as they travel through this landscape. And the bridges are created by guiding and growing tree roots that you can barely wrap your arms around when they're fully grown through a really carefully woven scaffolding of bamboo. They plant the trees, they take these tiny little roots, they string them and weave them through the scaffolding until these roots grow large enough to be planted into the opposite side of the river, and then they keep on growing, and about 50 years later, you can walk across these bridges, but they last for centuries in this landscape. There are about 75 of these structures in the Jayanti Hills, and they've been doing this process of growing bridges for 1,500 years. And it takes multiple generations of Kasi men to care for these roots until they've grown to the opposite bank, where they just get stronger with age. The Al Tala Islands of the Medan in southern Iraq are an islanding and housing system made from a single species of reed that's known as the kasab. And the Medan, they make these islands in various ways, but one of the ways is by fencing living reeds and then building up layers of reed and mud and reed until you create this buoyant, floating island. And what keeps these islands buoyant is the process of decay or decomposition, which creates little bubbles within the material, and that allows these biodegradable islands to float. And then they have these arched houses on top of these islands known as madif, and we've seen these particular houses in Sumerian Uruk imagery from 6,500 years ago. So this is a technique of building floating communities at 6,500 years old. And so you can see in this clip, which was taken by a colleague of mine, of one of these madif houses being built, that the kasab reed is actually integral to every single aspect of life. It actually provides food for water buffalo. People bake it into bread and they eat it, and then they make their houses out of it and their floating islands that they live on. And they construct these houses in 3 days, and they can deconstruct them and then move them. Incredibly adaptable. And the dried reed, it's so versatile. You can see here, it's bundled into these really large, thick columns that are counterweighted to form these arches. It's bundled into smaller rafters to form the roof. Then it's woven into the walls and into the floors and into the roofing system. And then it's also spun into twine that's used to wrap these buildings together, because these buildings are made without the use of any nails. And these Medan villages, they stay afloat for about 25 years. And the last example I want to show you is the Subac of Bali. And this is a system that's composed of underground water transfer tunnels that honeycomb the whole island of Bali. And then the surface of the island is terraformed into these credible rice terraces. These steep hills are transformed into these terrace systems that completely transform this incredibly rugged volcanic terrain. And this term Subac, it applies to what you see here, which are these terraces, which is a Subac is a watershed of farmers who cooperate, but it's also this rice terrace system. And there are 1,200 self-governing associations of farmers who share the same water and planting schedule. And by doing that, they've made the most biodiverse and productive agrarian system that we think is on Earth. And they do this without any fertilizer, without any pesticides, and they do it in the same Subac terrace that they've used for 1,500 years. And they do it at the scale of watersheds. They synchronize everything. And that's the trick of not using any pesticides, because they don't give the pest anything to eat. And the Subac farmers, they really carefully control water cycles, and that increases their yield by tenfold than growing normal rice terrace systems. And it actually, in a volcanic landscape with these really steep hillsides, it transforms what would be unfarmable land into this really productive system that's also really, really great for all the species at the bottom of the food chain that sit in these pans or in these pools. And what that means is that all these species at the bottom of the food chain provide food for terrestrial and avian and aquatic species that also rely on this particular landscape. And it's incredible for migrating species and breeding species, and that has made it one of the most important biodiverse landscapes on Earth. And so, with the scale and steepness of what you might see as a skyscraper, these rice terraces are really important considerations for how we think about ecosystems. They act as these massive absorption and purification systems, and these nutrient and biodiversity storehouses. So after showing you these three examples, I now want to fast forward you to the year 2040. And a project that just opened up at the Barbican in London that involved the design of new hybrid Lo-TEK that was in collaboration with these three communities, the Kasi, the Madan, and the Subac. So the idea for, you might want to click. The idea for the recent commission was really to open up new conversations. And there's sound for this, so if the sound could go up. Working with our engineers from Bureau Happold, the three communities, this particular piece called the Symbiocene creates, thank you, a playbook for how Western designers can collaborate with Indigenous knowledge keepers to create future technologies.
I see myself. Today, when I walk on a root bridge, my gratitude goes to my ancestors. So whether we can catalyze a root bridge to be completed within 20 years is another question altogether, because it does not only involve maybe bioengineering results, but it also involves all many other factors that are there in the environment or in the universe.
Joining you from my car all the way from Iraq. So the islands are made mostly out of reeds, and the reeds are hollow on the inside. If the soil is not good enough to hold the column in place, the foreman would go about excavating the soil and then using the water buffalo to compact the soil in small layers.
We need more water. They borrow water. What happens is they ask a couple of years up to their people who they don't know, and they say, send us more water now, and we'll pay you back next year by allowing you to change your irrigation cycle and taking more of our water in the next cycle.
So this multimedia piece includes a soundscape, models, projection mappings, physical earth samples, photography, illustrations, videos, pretty much anything we could get our hands on we put into this presentation. And what came out of it after working with these three communities and doing a series of workshops over a period of 6 months was 3 new low-tech innovations. And in addition, there was actually a 4th technology that emerged, which is a legal technical innovation that addresses Indigenous intellectual property rights. But what I want to show you first is the 3 technologies that are projection mapped onto 1:500 scale models. So the living canopy and walkways create a living urban transportation network that grows with a city. It's based upon the living root bridges, and this infrastructure was designed to significantly reduce impact of urban heat island effect, to increase urban biodiversity and create a comfortable microclimatic condition for pedestrians, especially in cities where you're receiving over 40-degree temperatures 70% of the year, which is what we're finding in India. The second technology is a floating community infrastructure for an adaptive waterfront neighborhood, which is inspired by the Madan. And so rather than forcing people to relocate, communities affected by rising waters are actually able to adapt and then live on buoyant, biodegradable infrastructures. And the third is a nature-based sharing and water cleansing infrastructure, which is inspired by the Subac rice terraces. And this system is actually designed to capture rainwater and run it through a system of diverse nature-based technologies, resulting in varying grades of water that then is distributed and siphoned off to communities for different uses. And then this forest technology, which was a surprise that came out of this process, but I think probably one of the most important pieces that came out was it's called an SOOU. And it is a sound shower in the space. That's the way you experience it. It's a contract between James Cameron, who's the CEO of Brerowina, which is a multinational engineering company that we worked with, and each of the community members who responded to his oath of understanding in their language. And so typically when what has been dealt with intellectual property rights in the field of biotech or biomedical is called an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding. And in accordance with the transfer Indigenous knowledge being oral rather than written, we created the SOOU, the Smart Oath of Understanding. It is designed to be entered into through unalterable smart contracts that are transparently encoded on the public blockchain. So Lo-TEK is a movement. It's seeding creativity in crisis, and it's inspired by technologies that were born from climate extremes. And so as we're drowning in this age of industrialization and information while starving for wisdom, we need a new mythology to guide us, one that isn't grounded in superiority or savior complex. And we need a mythology about connecting with nature, informed over thousands of years from those communities who have no word for nature in their language because they are not separate from it. And this statistic that I've shown you, it's not an accident. This is the culmination of thousands of years of knowledge and management and understanding of our single most important role as humans, which is to support other forms of life on this earth. That mythology of technology from the Enlightenment that separated us from nature was wrong. And humans are not separate from nature. And our collective new mythology of technology must be about designing symbiotically with nature, a symbiosis. A symbiosis is a collaboration. It's a relationship which is a common benefit. And if we protect life, we protect ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Julia. That was fantastic and truly inspiring, too. And now you also know where the images on the outer screens come from. You might have wondered about the artwork in the middle. It's by Cedar Tramasala. Cedar and Mathieu and the Congolese Plantation Workers Art League. You have also done research in technologies in distant places. But you kind of went the opposite way. You looked for resources of value extraction that your region and many others, especially in the tropical belt, have suffered from, and looked into how you can make use of these technologies yourself. Could you please guide us through the work that you've been doing in the past years in Lusanga, formerly Liverville?
Oui, comme merci pour la parole, Kolia. Nous sommes le CATPC, le Cercle d'Art des Travailleurs.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak. We are the Council of Workers in the Congolese plantations, and we would like to introduce ourselves, Mathieu Kaziyama, and my colleague Ted Tamasala. We've brought some pictures with us from our art workshop, the CATPC. This was the starting point that ultimately started us out on this long trip. We are a collective of artists, people who work on the plantations. We have men and women of all ages, young and old. In 2014 was when we started our work. Back then, we founded our artist collective and we started working with art. We have brought some images here. You can see here a sculpture from clay, from lime. This is the soil in Lusanga, our municipality, which is then exhibited as art, as culture, and indeed throughout the world. We use the income from these art sales to buy land, and on the land that we bought, we have succeeded in planting trees, and our aim is to continue planting trees. Our art circle has set itself the target of buying more land because our municipalities was where the company was previously headquartered, where the Unilever company was headquartered, and for over 100 years we had a palm oil center. So at this site we had Unilever as a multinational company with its headquarters, and Unilever is the reason why our commune was called Ville. And for over 100 years, Unilever earned high profits through the palm oil, and this was at the expense of the local community because our ancestors, our grandfathers and grandmothers suffered greatly. They were exploited, but not only the people, but also nature was exploited. The soil was exploited, and our art circle, CATPC, has set itself the objective of reversing this development. When we started producing our art, we sold the art, and this gave us a source of income. And our first aim, the first aim of our project was that we wanted to replant this land, not with monocultures that had destroyed the land, but with forest. Before monocultures were planted, there were large forests with tall, old trees that were deliberately felled to plant monocultures for palm oil. And after succeeding in buying this land with the income from our art sales, we began to look for solutions to help us stop the problem. When we tried to look for solutions, we carried out research on various different species of tree that produce different types of essences which can help the soil to recuperate more quickly. On the one hand, we want to establish an income from the local population, but also plant trees that help quicker regeneration of the soil. We would like to create a future for this soil. I talked about acacias before, and these are trees that grow very quickly. Rubber trees also have very large leaves which create shadows, and is very good for neighboring plants to grow in their shadows and enables the soil to regenerate very quickly. As I said before, our project started in 2014, and we've had a continuous development, and our project is going very well. As Mathieu Kazia, here you see Matthias Kaziame in New York, where he showed drawings and performed, and we exhibited films. That was our trip. And we use the income from our projects to build this museum, our own museum in Lusanga. We've now completed the construction, and thanks to this museum, which has now been completed, we have our own art project, which is our museum. As I said, we carried out research. In 2014, we began to concern ourselves with the sculpture of our ancestors, and today our ancestors also had sculptures, And we bundled these sculptures, and we will show you the results of our examinations and research. We have obtained differing answers. We've consulted scientists, academics, and we ended up with the sculpture of Banglo. This is a sculpture that was from a revolt of 1831. This people was very skilled at climbing trees, and they were kept as hostages. They were kept as hostages through the capitalist system under William Lever. They were deployed for the obtaining of palm oil, and always to the profit of Unilever, this multinational corporation. There was a man called Maximilien Valou, who was a colonial administrator who was used to collect taxes and who created a lot of damage. The Pendé people were supposed to pay taxes, but were exposed to a lot of violence. The men and women were locked in cages. I say men and women, but I really should say it was the women and children who were kept in cages, so that the idea was to, by keeping the women in cages, the aim was to force the men to come out of the forest so that they could be reused in the plantations as slaves. The original indigenous population then refused to pay the taxes, and then the commander, the boho, was executed, and his body was cut into various pieces. And then our ancestors used wood. They shaped this wood and produced a sculpture. And for them, according to their religion, they believed that this sculpture was embedded in the colonialism that had caused so much damage to the earth. So they had hoped to be able to capture and lock away the spirit of colonialism, and by so doing benefit the Pendé people. So this was a type of resistance against colonialism. We looked for this sculpture. It's a holy sculpture for us, and it enables us to do something for people and nature. This adventure involved a very long journey for us.
If I may add, I think we have also a film ready, like a condensation of your research, and we would be able to show it. If we look at it now, we will have more time to discuss in the round on applications afterwards. Yeah, should we see the movie?
Ça marche.
Kombo na ngai Mathieu Kasiama na botami awa na kati ya plantation ya Congo. Nakomi maintenant artiste pe lokola bandeko nyonso baza na kati ya mokili oyo. Totongi mize na biso eza polele eza vide na kati. Sikoyo etikali kiteki moko. Kiteki moko wana faleya. O basalaki ya balo. Objectif ya kokende voyage na biso eza pona kiteki wana ya résistance. Donc, ekosala résistance entre plantation na yango kiteki.
Ngolo na betu na kusonga tiba tekulu. Tala muntu ya ibenige mona. Tala histoire na yandi tala makamura yandi. Yo vanda vende betu salasa mu yo vutuara bampangi na bo. Sedar tamasalo wenda pe umarumilelo. Kiteki ina kuvana samu na kupesa ngolo na ba plantation.
wana tokomi déjà na kati ya États-Unis.
D'après nos renseignements, c'est vous qui l'aviez acheté du Congo.
En 72, en 72, j'ai passé à Gongo. J'ai laissé savoir, les gens comme ça, que j'étais collectionneur de l'art tribal, comme on disait à ce moment-là, traditionnel, si vous voulez, africain. Et alors, il y a un monsieur qui est venu avec une sculpture. Alors, il m'a dit, avec un peu de gêne comme ça, ben, ça, c'est une sculpture du blanc qui a été tué pendant la révolte des Pende en 1931. Alors ça, évidemment, ça m'a intéressé parce que ça, tout d'un coup, il y avait un intérêt historique et politique.
In the early 20s, a company called the Palm Works of the Belgian Congo, they opened a plantation at Lusanga. They were connected with the Lever brothers, with Palmolive soap, and the Pende did not want to ever go work there. But already by the mid-20s, the situation had gotten so bad that certain colonial officials, were protesting that they had been turned into slave traders. The most likely hypothesis is that this spirit might be wandering and very, very angry. And so that the power object was about getting control over the spirit of Alo and making him work for the Pende.
You and the people who resisted with this culture of ballet belong to the same world. Part of imperialism was to tell you that the ancestors, their power, you should forget about it. You should accept the imperial powers as your power.
J'ai sauvé cette pièce. Qui sait ce que cette pièce aurait été devenue si ce n'était pas cette histoire? Et maintenant, ça va d'un musée à l'autre, ça me fait plaisir.
The plantation is a very violent place. This is where most of the labor is enslaved or bonded, and the masters, of course, are not always comfortable with the fact that this is what we may call now dirty money. So the question is, how can this dirty money be turned into clean money? And if you put money in a museum, people always assume that a museum is a clean institution, it's a good place. So in a sense, one could say if you took away the plantation, you would not have the money to build all these great museums we see in Europe. But that connection has always been denied.
Ballot m'appartient plus.
Vous l'avez...
et ça appartient au musée à Richmond. Ils ont une très belle collection d'art africain.
You have to remove from these objects everything in order to have an abstract idea of what is art, which means give it its right place in this phantasmatic history of art. And why I'm calling it phantasmatic, because it didn't exist before they started to plunder. So what I'm saying is that plunder enabled the history of art.
Kihinde Wiley, you know his work? And over there is Japan. So we have Japan, China, and Korea. Don't go this way. Yeah, I have Luba. There's a Luba one over here. Yeah, Luba.
Professeur?
See?
La sculpture, elle est où?
It's in the Rietberg Museum in Zurich, Switzerland. Okay. They have a show on art from the Congo right now, so we loaned it to them for that show.
Professeur, si la sculpture peut voyager à Zurich, ça veut dire qu'elle peut aussi voyager au Congo, à notre musée, à la Plantation.
Let's hope that it happens.
Ozoya, Balo, Ozoya na Plantation, Obombela yo Makemba, Oya Olia kuna. Hein? Merci. Amoni photo na yo kuna, Balo, Balo, Balo. Oya Olia Makemba kuna. Oyo kia, Yango.
Yango.
Tomoni, ba professeur, ba expert, ba universitaire, po tokuwa ko mona kiteki oyo ya balo. Ya kuwa mpamba ve théorie ve me pratique mfuno.
That was an excerpt of the series Plantations and Museums, which we also have a link for on studiobonn.io. It was produced by CATPC, the Congolese Plantation Workers Art League. Yeah. And there were theoreticians speaking like Ariela Asulay, who is also taking part in the current Berlin Biennale, focusing on similar subjects, Zoe Strother and Simon Gikandi. And could you, it's just amazing that you, like, the same structure that you analyzed as being, in the end, extractive and exploitative of resources, the museum, that you built it also in your region. Could you quickly, though, walk us through your theory of exploitation that you put into this drawing, Zidar?
Oui. Ces dessins, ce grand dessin qui est récent, explique justement...
We have a script, and in this script we explain the trip of this culture that has traveled a long way, and at the same time the export of natural resources like palm oil and the loss of the rainforest and the loss of the forest that goes along with the exploitation of resources. And with this image we want to show you this trip of these resources. We have asked the museum to give us a sample of this, but we didn't give a positive reply. And for us this sculpture is sacred. It has a sacred meaning, and we want to give it to the service of the people in Lusanga. That was the ultimate game, that was against the oppression of the colonials, and we wanted to resist of the destructive force of and we asked to exhibit that piece, but that was rejected. And we want to get in touch with the force of this figure that is very important for us with our community. And we wanted to use these modern tools. We have downloaded an image of this tool from the website of the, and we have produced an NFT. And these are, in this case, pictures, images that are divided in 306 pieces, and with that you can show the figure, and we sell these FATs. There are 306 pieces of this image, of this drawing, and this represents a hectare. That means the sale of these pieces, and so this means to acquire one piece of land. So the multinationals that have destroyed our land can now acquire pieces. To buy these pieces enables us to buy land. We can then plant trees and fruit trees, for example, and that means we can live from that and we can generate income from that, but also species that enable us that the soil regenerates and that the diversity of the species will get bigger, that has decreased in the course of the time. That's why we have started this project. The sale has started. We have just split up this drawing in its atomic pieces, so to say, and the single pieces were put on the market, and some of the pieces have already been sold, and we hope that we generate income that enable us to get our land back, so that we feel good again in our homeland, and we want to bring the land back in its original status.
Visualization. We have the below NFT on the screen. If we could change to the computer, please. Please change the big screen to the computer. Sorry, there we go. So you dropped them yesterday at Art Basel. I think 306 NFTs have been minted from the Ballot sculpture. So you kind of use the social magic of NFTs, which, like, their power, it comes from social beliefs, right? Like the value that is granted to the certificate of ownership of something that is just a file, just digital data. It's a social belief, it's a social power. And it's amazing how you turn that at use to reactivate the powers of the Ballot sculpture. Thank you so much. So, if your presentation is ready, we can open the round. And I would be most excited.
Oui, c'était la fin. Oui, on a presque tout dit. La sculpture est là, elle n'est pas encore là, mais pour nous, la force de la sculpture, à travers ces fichiers, on peut le remettre au service de la communauté, notre communauté, pour pouvoir en faire du bien. Comme le but dans lequel cette sculpture avait été faite, c'était pour empêcher de nuire à la terre et au peuple de chez nous.
We would now like to put this sculpture at the disposal of our people, and we would like to do something good for these people that have suffered so much during the colonial period. Could I perhaps add something here? If you allow me to add something, then we should say that of course, the sculptures are not shown here as in our country. Sculptures are very important for us. They are a symbol of resistance, and there is a connection to the land, to the trees, to my ancestors. And in the museum, this sculpture was, if you like, in a showcase, imprisoned. But in our country, the sculpture is free. It can connect to the environment, to the trees, to the ancestors. I wanted to add this. That was very important.
Thanks so much. So Dan Mathieu will also be in the Art Basel talks tomorrow in the afternoon, and also be present at Documenta, which opens on Friday. In the opening days, and have more presentations. And they will be accompanied by Renzo Martins, who has worked with CRTPC for many years. And could you just quickly elaborate what's your role in the project, and how do you see your role in the future?
Well, I'm an artist. I'm a Dutch white male artist, and I've come to realize over many years that my art practice, and I guess the art practice of many people, is completely dependent on the exploitation of other people. I thought it was very interesting, the idea that Julia shared, that the main question is whether one individual gives back more to nature or takes more from nature.
It was Yusuf's question,
sorry,
actually, but I'm happy that it gains its own life.
It was very great, yes. And I've come to realize that you know, however critical my art may be, I made films in the past about how unjust the world is, how, you know, how terrible it really is for many people on the globe, that however much I tried, that these art pieces, these critical art pieces, critical of colonialism, of economic inequality, in the end generated much more wealth, financial wealth, in some parts of the world, the already rich parts of the world, and that it generated very, very little wealth or beauty or skills or in the zones of extraction. So even if my work dealt with exploitation, in and of itself, it was exploitative. And maybe it still is. There's simply no way to undo 500 years of colonialism with art, I'm afraid to say. And so that's when I decided that I had to try and contribute to reversing this system. And it's when I went to Congo again, which is where I made previous films, and where I met Cédar and Mathieu and many other people, and where we decided that maybe the benefits of critical art should not just be in New York or Berlin or even Cape Town or Dakar, but that the benefits of critical art, critical of colonialism, of art wanting to decolonize, that these benefits should also be in the mines and in the plantations. Because the art world is completely dependent of these mines and plantations. Many European art museums, including, for example, Tate Modern, next to the Barbican, has been completely funded with profits extracted from plantations, including the plantation where Mathieu and Cédar and many other people live and work. And museums in the West have been financed by extractive labor on plantations. And so I've tried to help contribute to a system in which the benefits of all these critical analyses can also bring better ideas, better futures, more love, ultimately, more money, more love, on the very plantations from which it was taken away. So that's what I try to do, somehow.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So in the next years, what will be your role?
If I can contribute as somewhat of an agent to make these systems be reversed, I would gladly do so. Obviously, on these plantations now, here and now, people make $18 a month if you're a male and $9 a month if you're a woman. And these are plantations working for the global economy. They fuel our economies. And so if you work all month, and in the end of the month you make $9, chances that you'll be able to participate in those debates, in these debates, are very, very, very slim. You know, you won't have even 1 minute of credit on a phone that you won't have. So we need to build systems of solidarity. And those systems of solidarity can not only be part of exhibitions in nice art shows, they should be on the ground for people to use. And I'm an artist, I'm not a lawyer or a business person or a politician, so I can only do it through artistic means. Yeah,
that completes the global picture that we have gathered in the past hour about global working relations in the end, and models of care for nature and future generations. Before I ask the many questions that came up for me hearing your talk, I would be more interested if you guys have questions to each other. Then I'll start with Youssef. The change of mindsets that you presented. What tools are you thinking of, or what bodies could instigate these changes of mindset? Maybe you also want to elaborate about the new initiative you have founded under the umbrella of the UN.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that question, because as you were asking, or right before, I was thinking that two tools that are very clear in my mind because of this discussion is that of art and of technology. I mean, we've heard how our friends here have used NFTs in an innovative way in order to promote a sustainable practice in the plantations, and the use of art as well. And I was just watching a recent David Attenborough series on prehistoric world, which provided you the very vivid portrayal of how life was thousands of years ago. And I was saying, why doesn't anyone do something like this for our future life, to show people how a world of solidarity could look like, how a world of well-being, where we are living in an equitable system of social, economic, political activity, as well as having a regenerative outlook towards nature, etc. So I'm hoping that at some point we would bridge that chasm where we would use art, whether visual or otherwise, to provide in every human being's mind a very clear vision of how that beautiful future can be. Right now, we're using more or less scaring tactics. You know, if we continue like this, 100 million people will die, this will happen, whatever. And typically, this is not very conducive to that mental transformation. So I'm hoping that art can be used in that. And you asked about the initiative Resilience Frontiers. So right now, there are 3 advisory groups going on. One of the most interesting ones is the one on impact, which looks at cutting-edge communication and behavioral change methods to see how can we help nudge human thinking towards valuing that new notion of well-being and future sustainability and regeneration, and showing that it can lead to abundance. And it's interesting, we have people from a lot of, I mean, top people from different areas, both of show business, marketing, nudging, data analytics, etc., and creating new knowledge of what would work best to transform mindsets. We have another group looking at how can you create prioritization methodologies to actually triage out what I was talking about, which is what would be the first mover activity that can create that flywheel effect towards the transformed world we're talking about. There's a third group looking just at technologies, how the interplay between the different evolution of what we know is in the pipeline can create new dynamics, so we don't fall into the fallacy of linear extrapolation. I mean, 30 years ago, when, late 70s, early 80s, when the personal computers first came out, the prediction of the biggest experts was that this would lead to us working a lot less, actually 4 days a week. Of course, what we're doing now is working 7 days a week instead, because the assumptions that we use in projecting into the future are typically very limited. We have a poverty of imagination, and I think we need to use a bit more the right brain with the help of art and with the help of technology, as opposed to just merely the left brain, which has got us to where we are now.
And who's the artists or writers or analysts you're working with? Like, whose thinking is going into your project?
I mean, in terms of what we call the Impact Advisory Group, we have science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson, for example, who wrote Ministry for the Future. We have Roy Conley, who's an Oscar-winning animation producer with Disney. We have a lot of others who who are still in the process of contributing. It's not, the deliberations and outcomes are not published at this point, but it is an ongoing conversation. So there's typically once every month we have an hour or two with them and move the methodology forward.
Thank you.
Would your main goal be to change the let's say the practices of the part of the global population that pollutes more, or would the main goal of this technology that you try to develop be to help out most of the people who don't consume that much and don't pollute that much, but who are suffering the most under climate change, etc.?
It's to help change the values and the worldview, exactly what Julia was saying. And a few days ago we had an event where we were looking at the future of the world economy and how to transform economic principles to be consistent with a sustainable world. And invariably the priority there that came out was totally focused on values and on education, not on economics, even though what we were there to discuss was the global economy. So yeah, how to shift mindsets in a way to align them with what a good way of living would be. And I showed the anomalies in my presentation, that we have the intent, and yet we find ourselves moving in the opposite direction, as if we're being controlled by something that's not within our reach. So the idea of looking into the future and not assuming that the future descends on us from Mars, but that we create it, gives us a bit more agency in trying to provide incentives and disincentives to move that change in mindset. And I know one of the biggest untapped areas is that of art, and I'm sure that there can be a lot more done there to help create these positive visions of the future that complement what we've been having so far, which is the doomsday scenarios.
Seda, can I ask you how Julia's presentation resonated with you, and what is your take on the question how indigenous knowledge can play a role in mitigating climate change, or in care for more biodiversity and maybe also more diverse social economies?
Oui, je crois que c'est ce que nous avons essayé de faire, ou ce que nous essayons de faire avec...
Yes, we have tried to do that. We want to get that sculpture back. That's a sculpture that our ancestors have made, and this sculpture gives us strength, and we want to remake the forest with the force that our statue gives us, and that is one opportunity against this destructive procedure, to fight against this destructive forces in the world that damage everything. And we continue looking for other things. That's not all yet. We know that the knowledge of our ancestors, that traditional knowledge, you can also see that in the movie.
Le doyen qui nous applique la craie blanche sur
the eldest of our village has put white chalk on our hand, and that was a ritual to protect us and to give us strength, so that we can remake the forest through the structure that we will bring home, that's based on monocultures that have destroyed the soil, and that has led to the extinction of local animals, that has destroyed everything. The ancestors can give us strength. We don't use the term indigenous, but we speak about the First Nation parents or our ancestor. That's our, we don't like the term indigenous. The force that we get from our ancestors, we give it back to the land. So that's how the circle is closed, and we get our force from the soil, and we give it back.
That you founded. Could you elaborate on what knowledge you are transferring to kids there?
La première des connaissances, c'est, je parlerai de la cérémonie Moshi, qui veut dire un.
I want to talk about ceremony. That's a ceremony called Moshi, and that means one. And that is a ceremony that our ancestors have done in the past. And palm oil is put into the soil, and then everyone in our community get together and put their finger in this little hole that we have dig, and we think in this moment about a dear wish that's important to us, that we wish for. One of it says it aloud, but everyone think at the same time that is important to them, and by that we contribute that the children that go to school get connected with the traditional knowledge that was destroyed with colonialism. And we were told that go to church, you must pray to God.
Après 1960, et on a du mal à apprendre aux enfants nos coutumes ancestrales.
Today it's like we are still praying as we were told prior to 1960, and we have to relearn as we can do since 1960. In the ET classes, we have no problems to gain students. The students are fully booked, but for example, if we have other classes where it's about the traditional medicine, then we have less interested people. During Corona, during COVID, we have practiced traditional medicine. We had very little death, and we used traditional roots and herbs, but there was a barrier. Many people don't understand that, and we have to overcome these resistances that people have to concentrate on the ancestral knowledge. But through this school, we want to revive the practices of our ancestors and to overcome this hurdle. I think people are always resistant to change. I'm also sometimes resistant to change, but I think we have to teach people how they keep their environment intact. I don't know whether I've answered the question.
On a fait la true, la plante qui était la plante médicinale.
If you ever come to visit us, we have like a plantation with herbs and with a curing tree, and if you ever come to see us, we would love to show you. The children can observe what we are doing, and we show them to, but we are not only living for today, but we are also living for the future. Things that we are doing today might serve future generations. The palm trees that we have planted already are used to generate palm oil, but not only for future generations, but I think there are also many good ideas that we can give our children. We have cultivated herbs, curing herbs, Mumba Lumba and other curing herbs, Kagi. So that means many curing herbs that we used to use in the past.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I can just recommend, I was also there a few years ago visiting in Lusanga. Julia, what strikes me especially about what you did. It's like, it's one thing to do a beautiful coffee table book where Stuart Brand says, like, all my friends talk to me when they see it at my coffee table. It's another way to really think through the relationship, the economic relationship of indigenous knowledge and Western modes of extraction. And then to think about reparations. So the smart contract that you develop goes really far, or the smart oath, as you call it. I would love to read it in full, but we don't have the time tonight. But could you tell us what ways of making law, of making agreements, what ways of cooperation did you encounter that were new for you and went into that contract?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting that where the contract came from, and through the process of introducing these communities and working through these workshops with the communities and introducing them to the engineers, immediately the engineers were, we got to put this in a project that we're doing in London, in Hong Kong, in Shanghai. And it was partially sort of part of a nightmare scenario that I had thought would happen. And so it was emergent out of an understanding that there was a recognition that the value of this knowledge was immediately recognized in the context that we began working. And so to protect this intellectual indigenous property, we created the Smart Oath of Understanding. And it was written, we basically had to go back to very fundamental contractual language. One, because it was a smart oath, a spoken word contract. It had to be short, it had to be incredibly concise, it had to be available linguistically to many, many people. It also had to be incredibly aspirational. I think what we're trying to do is actually in the future, to sort of craft a rewriting of how people are thinking about intellectual property of biodiversity, and to make a much larger change beyond this particular exhibition. What is acknowledged in the Smart Oath is initially an acknowledgement that this is incredible intellectual property, that the intellectual property is owned by the community. The intellectual property is being shared with the rest of the world for the benefit of the planet, that in no way, that it will continually be respected as the intellectual property of that community, that the knowledge is being shared, and that there will be value recognized in that knowledge, that the knowledge would be valued in terms of reparations to that community in the future. And because there has been a history of not abiding to contracts, we made it a Smart Oath, which means that it will be triggered whether there are lawyers involved. It becomes this autonomous piece of technology that is publicly accessible. It is transparent. It will allow for decentralized distribution of profits. It will use cryptocurrency, which sort of actually works very well with some of the indigenous communities that we were working with. They have smartphones. We would be able to distribute the monies that came from any patenting of these technologies back to those communities, back to the organizations within those communities, and that could be done in a decentralized fashion. So there were all these engagements with the use of the technology, which we were calling crypto is like the Lo-TEK of economic systems, that were really paired incredibly well, and it was really I think an incredible understanding of value sharing and the idea of how does there become a benefit and a reciprocity between the community and the corporation. I think in the future we want to take it a lot further and think about, well, how could these working groups or these workshops give back to the community and change the idea of what value is? So we're not just thinking of economic value, we're thinking of cultural value, we're thinking of social and environmental value, and how do we broaden that concept of value as well?
Thank you. That was another night of the Exchange Values series at Studio Bonn, where we had the director of the Uffizi, Eike Schmidt, talking about his minting of a Michelangelo from the Uffizi collection. We had Hito Steyer as guest, who declared the Bundeskunsthalle minted as an NFT and occupied by the people, coming back and have the people vote on the future of the Bundeskunsthalle. And I'm excited that we have two global models of cooperation tonight in the room. Thank you so much for presenting them. Julia, thanks so much. Thank you, Yusuf. Good luck for the last negotiations tomorrow. Thank you, Mathieu. Thank you, Seda, for coming all the way. Thank you, Renzo, for coming with them. And thank you all for being here tonight.